If any of you filmmakers are like me, lighting can be challenging and frustrating when, despite your best efforts, your shots turn out like this, and this. But the good news is, they don't have to. Here are the 4 keys of cinematic lighting. Before I discuss those 4 keys, don't click away. I have to say, sometimes good lighting, the right lighting that establishes the appropriate mood and tells your story effectively, will not adhere to any of these 4 keys at all. Got it? All right. Here is key number 1. Generally speaking, you want to have a broad range of tones in your image. You want to have highlights, midtones, shadows. So as you are setting up the lighting, seek to find ways to incorporate in your shots points of brightness, points of darkness, and points in the middle. In my day-to-day existence, this is why I almost always hate fluorescent lighting. It's uniform and flat, not to mention the color temperature is just putrid. So one of the first things I will do when I walk into an environment like this one is turn off the overheads and turn on the practicals. Already so much better, right? Why? Because we have a broad range of tones. We have highlights, midtones, and lowlights. Flat versus dynamic. One other thing I love to do, if that environment has a window, is turn off all the other lights and just allow the window light to illuminate that environment. Because in so doing, you'll discover this lovely, broad range of tones. Obviously the brightest being near the window and the darkest being the furthest away from it, and in between, this lovely gradient. While not always appropriate to the specific mood and story that you're trying to tell, simply seeing what your window light has to offer is one of the fastest ways to cinematic light. Take a look at some stills from some of your favorite films, and I can almost guarantee that most of them will have a broad range of tones. Highlights, shadows, midtones. Numerous shadows, numerous highlights. That was key number 1, a broad range of tones. Now, key number 2, separation and depth. One of our primary objectives with our cinematic lighting ought to create depth in our image, creating the illusion that this 2-dimensional frame is in fact 3-dimensional. And we can do this by creating distinct foregrounds, midgrounds, and backgrounds, giving each of those planes their own level of illumination. To reiterate, a distinct foreground, midground, and background, creating distinct planes that stand out from each other. So to accomplish this depth, I will look for or intentionally stage different elements in the foreground, midground, and background, and then light each of those with different levels of illumination, accenting their separation and clarifying that frame's depth. Once again, you will frequently see this concept employed in some of your favorite films. This shot here from Parasite, the foreground being the most shadowed, the midground carrying those midtones, and the background being the brightest. How about this beautiful shot from Peaky Blinders that does it slightly differently, allowing the midtones to be in the foreground, the shadows to be in the midground, and the brightest portion to be in the background. One great way to separate your subjects from the background is to use backlight. With it, I'm given this lovely outline, which separates me that much more from the background. And so, in an effort to create that separation and depth, use backlight. And this works for interior environments as well as exterior environments. Here's a fantastic shot from the greatest film of all time, Bilbo and Gandalf both having a very strong backlight that separates them from the background. Similarly, in the shot from In the Heights, the window light is acting as the backlight and giving the character of Usnavi a lovely outline to separate him from the background. So that was key number 2, separation and depth. Now, key number 3, balance and control. This is oftentimes one of the more challenging for us cinematographers to achieve, if only just because our eyes are that much better than our camera's sensor. Our camera's sensor can only accommodate a certain brightness range. So while you may walk into an environment like this one and with your eyes see something a bit like this and therefore deduce balance and control achieved, I can, with my eyes, see out the window as well as into the shadows. Unfortunately, I hate to break it to you, but this is a lie. This is what the camera actually sees. What you were actually looking at a moment ago was a composite. I took 2 different shots, one where I exposed for the exterior and one where I exposed for the interior, and stitched them together. Furthermore, just looking at it with our eyes, we might deduce that the white light coming from this lamp is equal to the light coming from our window, which it is not. Here's that exterior light adjusted for interior light. And this is what happens when my scene is being lit by lamplight, but I tell my camera it's being lit by sunlight. And when you mix these two together in the same frame, it's either going to look bad one direction or the other. Neither of them a win. So what do you do when you arrive to a location like this and find the contrast so very high? The highlights so very bright and the low lights so very dim. Well, like we already talked about, you could, if you wanted to, take the time to composite two different exposures together. But again, this is impractical and extremely time-consuming, so let's consider 4 other options. Option number 1, use something called ND, or neutral density gels. These are essentially sunglasses for windows. What you could do is cut that neutral density gel out and place it into the window, bringing down the overall exposure outside the window. Additionally, you could bring up the exposure in the interior environment by turning on additional lights. Unfortunately for us, competing with the giant ball of fire in the sky does require a lot of firepower. Hallelujah. One other way to achieve balance is to simply change the angle, just seeing out the window and adjusting your exposure accordingly, or just seeing into the interior and adjusting your exposure accordingly. The final way to deal with blown out window light is to embrace the look. Perhaps it's appropriate to the mood you're trying to establish and the story you're trying to tell, which might be about a man slowly losing his mind. Now, it should be said, every film has different needs. Some of them need to have a very high contrasty look. But do not think for a second that there are only 2 categories: high-key, flat, commercial lighting with little to no dynamic range, or low-key, moody lighting with blown-out highlights and inky blacks. Now, I would contend that the most cinematic lighting is somewhere in the middle, which is why I would encourage you, when shooting outdoors, even if you're using the sun as your backlight or side light, to see what happens if you soften that light with some diffusion. And then see what happens when you bring some negative fill over to the shadow side. Like I've said, it does depend on the story you're telling and the mood you're trying to create, but the point is, be intentional in how you control and balance the light. The same thing goes for controlling and balancing the color temperature of your light. Obviously, there are examples, like this amazing shot here from the Royal Tenenbaums, where the filmmaker wanted to lean towards a uniformity in the color temperature. With that said, there are many times where it is completely appropriate to mix color temperatures. This frame, for example, has a mixture of color temperatures in it. Behind me is lamplight, 3200 degrees Kelvin, and coming in from the window, the sunlight is 5600 degrees Kelvin. Yes, indeed, there are instances where it is completely appropriate to intentionally and with care mix color temperatures, either because it's more natural and realistic, or you're wanting to separate certain elements from each other. But one of the key differences of the frames on the left, which I like, and the frames on the right, which I do not like, is that those on the left separate the color temperatures, giving one to the subject and one to the background, whereas those on the right mix the color temperatures on both the subject as well as on the background, which is just about as unfortunate as forgetting to properly secure your C-stand. So the third key of cinematic lighting was control and balance, and the fourth and final key of cinematic lighting is shape. As opposed to flat front light, side and back lighting reveals shape and texture. Of course, there are instances where you might want to have flat, bland front light, but they're few and far between. One thing that you'll notice in a lot of your favorite films is that the short side of the subject, that being the side that is away from camera, will be the one that receives the key light, whereas the broad side, the side that is closer to camera, will be the one that is more in shadow. This just creates that much more dimensionality and is often that much more flattering for the subject. One simple way to think about how to achieve this shape with your light is to place your subject in between your camera and your source of light, rather than your camera in between your subject and source of light. The fifth key of cinematic lighting is just add as much fog as you can to your environment. This makes instantly everything way more epic, way more cinematic. Just fill your environment full of it, just like so. Those are your 5 principles of cinematic lighting. When it comes to all the other cinematic tools in your tool belt, we still have to discuss color, movement, the lens, and texture. Definitely comment below and let me know which of those you would like me to discuss next, and if you enjoyed this video, check out last week's where we discussed the frame. I think you really enjoy it. Until next time though guys, have a good one. Cheers.